But if there's something that just you can't let go all the time, you're researching, you find yourself gravitating it, that is probably a great place to go because...
You are a teacher in the UK,
yes.
Is that correct? And so you teach film and television or writing? And
correct, film production, University of Portsmouth.
Oh, okay. And what percentage of the students are native to the UK?
90% of them are British, and then there's another 10 that come from everywhere. China, Central Europe, and we get, one of the places we get are a lot of Eastern European country. We had one girl who came from the UK, sorry, not the UK, Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
Okay, which, in this day and age was interesting. And she had an interesting perspective getting back to what we were talking before. So we talked about some of her stories that she wanted to, about her film that she wanted to make. And we talked about the war and whatnot and all that. And she said, I don't really want to do that myself. There's other parts of my culture I'd really want to talk about. And I was like, okay, like what? And she said, well, have you ever heard of, you probably have heard of the character Baba Yaga if you're a
yes.
John Wick fan, right? And she says, but that comes from my country. And I'd like to tell something about that, like where it comes from, who she is, and maybe tie that to what's going on right now. And that was, and we worked through that about that fairy tale. But what we try to tell us, and so this ties into some of the other things about what we've been saying is, if you have something from your past, or your culture, whether that's in this case Ukrainian or British, or maybe you're from the South in the States, or you're from Seattle or whatever, there's something that might be in your life or from your culture that is unique to you and your point of view. Those are great places to start with for telling stories. I believe Greta Gerwig, her story Lady Bird, right? Her film Lady Bird, that was her growing up, So the lessons learned from that and the situations coming from something like from there in Northern California where she was from, we hadn't seen much of that before. And, even though the mother-daughter relationship and what she was seeing around with a teenage girl growing up was something that we have seen before in film, her unique spin on it and what Lady Bird went through made it unique. Same with this young woman from the Ukraine who was telling a story about how that witch character is seen in her culture and then tied it to kids disappearing, it was kind of a Hansel and Gretel kind of thing going on, which was something that was happening with the war going on, the kids getting taken, right? And then you have that woman we were talking about earlier, the filmmaker, the Indian filmmaker, and all that came from her culture. So at least from your stories, if you can find something or issues you have from your growing up or from that happened that really, really well, those are great places to start.
Do you ever see where someone can get caught up in their own culture and the idea of what's a good person and what's a bad person? And maybe it's a very gray area. It's not where anyone's harmed someone,
right,
but that they can't get it out of their head that, well, a good male or female would never do this because
right,
their role is this.
Right.
And how it's maybe hard to free themselves from that? Or is that not something they need to worry about because they're trying to write from a place of authenticity?
Whenever I've experienced that, that's usually because you know it so well, you don't have that problem. Usually, if you know it well, you understand who that person is. What you're really figuring out is how complicated that person is. And then what I would suggest is you lean into the complexity of that person. Okay, the good and bad. Of course, you're going to probably change it a bit to fit into the storytelling paradigm, if you will. The needs of telling a movie or of writing something like that. But generally speaking, I find that isn't so much. The larger problem is being so detailed into it that and so insular and so inside baseball that it's impenetrable to the outside world. Okay, so you have to strike a balance between all the detail and the problems of the world and who these characters are, and then putting that onto some sort of story that is accessible. It's sort of, in a way, the other side of the coin of the hiding in the genre. Is you don't want to, you want to give them a medium that people can latch on and go and understand, but it can't be so impenetrable that and so dense that that the audience gets lost.
I see. Okay, so there has to be something that we can identify with.
Yes.
Doesn't matter where we're from.
Right. I would suspect that even at some point, the writer in that situation, there might be some meat left on the bone that they haven't fully been able to get to or get out because of the conventions that they have to adhere to in order to tell a story of that way. I would assume that there's just certain levels that they just can't get to because they are either too esoteric or just wouldn't work on film. They work much better in a novel, for example.
In your writing, how do you know you have a story that you really want to tell?
It's when I can't stop thinking about it. That's usually the first clue. This happened recently, actually, a film that I was writing before the one that I'm writing now. So I grew up in, we were talking about growing up, and I grew up in sort of upper middle class thing. Most of the people in my family have degrees. They went to university, college. They, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degrees, and they went to work. And it was more of a career over family world that I came into. And when you get into that mode, you start mixing with kids who are like-minded, right? So you go to university, and most of the people there are career over family. And then I move out here to Los Angeles, and you're working in industry. Most people are career over family to begin with. They're all trying to make it in some way, and people don't have families until much later on in life, often cases, if they do, even if they have them at all. Okay, and when I left LA and I moved to this one part of the UK, I found myself in a much different world, fish out of water, where I was outside my son's school, talking to a woman who was younger than I, probably about 10 years. And our kids were coming out of the school together. And I said to, my son says, hey, can I have a play date with John? And I said, well, I'll just talk to John's mom here and we'll sort it out. The woman turns to me and she says, oh, I'm not John's mom, I'm his grandmother.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And I was sort of like, backtrack, right? And it's like, all right, well, we'll talk to your mom and we'll start. And this kept happening over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. And I realized that I was the unusual one in this situation. And it probably made me think back in that hometown of mine that probably family before career was more common than I thought it was. And there was probably this whole other world out there that was foreign, that I didn't know about because I was young and now I was seeing. So that was on my mind a lot. I was thinking about that a lot now, having come to this new place and experiencing this new paradigm where family was more important than career was more important than family. And so when I read a book that a colleague of mine had written, a novel about a 18-year-old woman who is going to be the first one in their family to go to college, to university, and she comes from a long line of teen moms. And the summer before she's supposed to go, she gets pregnant. And then the book uses sort of a Groundhog's Day technique to show all the choices that she could potentially make. This was on my mind. I read this book, and I knew that this was a good idea. Okay, because I'd been really thinking about it a lot, and it was something that was weighing on me. Now, often you don't get perfect kismet like that, but at least now my brain was open to that. So I often find that if there's something bothering me in the world, if there's something I'm constantly thinking about or wondering, why doesn't that work? This is really good if you're going to make documentary films too. But if there's something that just you can't let go all the time, you're researching, you find yourself gravitating it, that is probably a great place to go, because you can't consume enough of the world, right? That you're going to go the extra mile in research. You're going to get to know who these characters are. You're going to probably write down in your notes, that happens, this happens, this happens, that, but that's an obstacle, that's a character, that's a potential antagonistic force, okay? These are the possible outcomes that could happen. This is how they're perceived in a positive way, this is how they're perceived in a negative way, or in between those two poles, right? And that's where you're going to get the nuance. If there's something that's bothering you, if there's something you can't stop thinking about, that's probably a realm where there's a good story and a good concept. You just got to dig.
Wow, that's fascinating. So that little instance of being outside of your child's school and realizing, in a sense, how much more of a fish out of water you were.
Right.
And wow, and it's a good thing you thought that was the mom and not the grandma.
Yeah. If it had gone the other way, it would have been horrible. I was going to say,
that went way better than if the opposite happened.
But I would also say this, now that you've just said that, is being open to those moments. Okay, there's a version of that story where I become really embarrassed. Well, I was embarrassed, but I become so embarrassed that I shut down and I go, "Oh, Jesus Christ, why did we move here? Why am I having problems with this? Why this keeps happening over? I can't stand this. I want to get out of here," right? And I shut down, and then maybe even that's something to explore as a possible story about why you do that. My guess is that if you're that closed off, you wouldn't do that you wouldn't explore it. But I was lucky that I left myself open to that, and was thankful that I was willing to explore that deeper. And at least when the book came along, I was able to be open enough to realize that, okay, even though that's not a type of story that I would normally write, that's the right story for me.
Wow.
Now at this point in my life.
Sure. Had you grown up there, maybe it would be nothing that would cross your mind. It would be so normal.
Well, that's an interesting point, because the author of the book did have that instance. So she's coming at it from more like the Greta Gerwig Ladybird story way. This is her experience of what and everything that she experienced being an 18-year-old or I think she was even younger, having a child, and all the prejudices that she had and the struggles she had, and also the great things that she had. All the insensitive things that people said to her, right? And the stigmas, but also the wonderfulness of when you have a kid and all the good things that come from that, and then all the struggles that come from that, and the sleepless nights, and the on and on and on and on it goes. So you're right, probably, in a way, that it's possible that if I had grown up there, I might not have been open to that because it was so normal. And that it would have taken something extraordinary for me to open my eyes to that. Perhaps as a male, I would have looked at something else, something that had to do with football, soccer, or some sort of male-oriented thing. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Right. That's why I had asked earlier about just these roles, so much as the different cultural roles. Even if the culture is many generations removed from the original place and they're in the States, there's all sorts of cultural expectations and stigmas. And
I think that if you're from, that can be, and that's where if you're in it and you're open to it, and if you reflect upon it, that is this normal or isn't this normal, and how does that look judged against other world? That's where you can find some interesting stories because you're of it and you know it really well. Conversely, if you come into it, as I did, as a fish out of water with fresh eyes, that's not what I'm used to. Why is that like that? That is another way into the world. I would often say that you probably, successful TV series where you have writers' rooms, you probably want a mix of the two, I would think. Because then you get sort of you know, one says this is how it is, and the other one could say, but you know, you're in it so much, you might miss this interesting thing that you think is normal, but I think is extraordinary, right?
Right.
Some nuance of the life or the culture or the problems of the world, and then I think between the two and maybe others, that's how you can build a really interesting show. Or if you're a writing team, you could you have two sets of eyes or multiple sets of eyes to, you know, really milk the world for what it is.
Right, the Norman Lear, as you said earlier, the A coming against
Yes.
B, and then the C comes in.
Yes.